Hi, I am Annie Foner, and I was part of the Bangladesh group for the final project, and I did the first two parts of the presentation. Where is Bangladesh located? Bangladesh is bordered by India on the west, north, and part of the east border. It also has a slight border connection to the southeast to Myanmar, also known as Burma. It is also located along the delta plains of both the Padma and Jamuna rivers. These two rivers flow into the Bay of Bengal, which borders the bottom part of Bangladesh. The Bay of Bengal is the largest bay in the world based on area. It is also a huge wetland and marsh due to the size of the deltas. There have been many skirmishes between the borders due to the tense history between the countries. The history of Bangladesh. Britain came in and took over in 1700. They implemented laws and restrictions on how much land natives were allowed to have, along with other things, including who could govern. They also took natural resources from the land and used the land as a means for trade. Their reign lasted until 1947. In the wake of the war about both religious differences and oppression, the country was split into the two regions formerly known as West and East Bengal. Over the time, the surrounding countries started warring, and the provinces of East and West Bengal began to split up. West Bengal was merging in with India, and East Bengal became known as East Pakistan. This was done through what is known as the Pakistan Resolution in August of 1947. East Pakistan then went through a reign of Pakistani rulers from 1947 to 1971, when Bangladesh became the country we know now. As the country progressed, East Pakistan made the request in 1965 after a skirmish between India to have autonomy. This transferred over to the independence of Bangladesh in 1971. In 1972, the first prime minister was elected. In 1973, the Bangladesh Constitution was created. In 1974, Bangladesh joined the United Nations. After admittance into that group, the country started working on repairs in transportation, communication, and international trade, along with education, health, and production of these industries. The top industries in Bangladesh are cotton textile, jute textile, garments, paper, fertilizer, irons and steel, cement, petroleum products, cigarettes, matches, drugs, pharmaceuticals, tea, salt, and edible oil. They also have a shrimp farming industry due to the geographical advantages of living in the marshy delta and the Bay of Bengal. However, the most notable of these industries are the agricultural and textile and garment industries, and they go hand in hand. Because they go hand in hand and they are the largest, I chose these to show the differences in the pandemic. They make up about 5.2% of Bangladesh's population employee. It employs about 5.2% of Bangladesh's population. So directly before the pandemic hit, the Bangladesh garment industry was on the rise, over doubling its profits from 2011 to 2019. It went from $14 billion to $13 billion industry. Once the pandemic struck, it took a hit, went to $28 billion in production that year. However, it seems to only have been a minor setback because it is now suspected to be about $31 billion industry and is gaining quickly. Being as this is Bangladesh's biggest industry, it makes sense of why the rebound was so quick. However, it did have some pandemic setbacks, and these were inequality in both benefits and pay, health issues, and safety issues. And these were coming to light right before the pandemic, and they were getting a lot of public press and being open to the public eye. However, when the pandemic struck, they all kind of got swept under the rug, and the problems need to be addressed before the industry can continue and continue to grow. And these are my sources.
So to begin, Bangladesh's main economic indicators consist of their GDP, inflation rate, unemployment rate, HDI, and GNI. And as first shown here, this graph here shows Bangladesh's GDP from 1960 to 2020. And as can be seen, the GDP increased slowly from 1960 to 2012. But swiftly after that, GDP reaches a peak of 324.239 billion in 2020, despite the global slowdown caused by the pandemic. Overall, the GDP shows that Bangladesh's economy is expanding and heading into the right direction. Next here is Bangladesh's unemployment rate from 1991 to 2020. Bangladesh's unemployment rate has consistently been over 2%, with two noticeable truths. In 2006, when the unemployment rate fell to 3.59%, and the other one being in 2010, when the jobless rate fell to 3.38%. In 2020, the unemployment rate peaks at a high of 5.30%. This graph here shows Bangladesh's inflation rate, and Bangladesh's inflation rate has various peaks and troughs over the course of its history, which spans from 1987 to 2020. Inflation rates fell to 3.01% in 1993 and 2.38% in 1996. The inflation rate also reaches two important peaks, one in 1995 when it reaches 10.30%, and the other in 2011 when it reaches an all-time high of 11.40%. In recent years, Bangladesh's inflation rate has remained relatively stable at around 6.0%. This graph here shows Bangladesh's GNI, or gross national income, which starts at just 8.108 billion in 1973 and steadily rises until 2007 when it begins to expand more rapidly, reaching 338.933 billion in 2020, indicating that the economy is expanding every year. Last to talk about is Bangladesh's HDI, or Human Development Index. Even though its history is brief, the HDI starts at just 0.394 in 1990, indicating that the country had a low degree of social and economic development, and it has steadily climbed with no trots all the way to 0.632 in 2019, placing it as the 133rd country with the highest HDI value. Next to talk about is Bangladesh's business cycles. Throughout Bangladesh's history, there have been numerous takeaways from their business cycles. Bangladesh has its first recession from 1962 to 1963, which develops into a depression once the GDP growth rate drops to negative 0.456% in 1963, after which the economy expands to its maximum point of 10.953% in 1964, as shown on the graph here. Bangladesh similarly had a severe crisis from 1970 to 1974, with the GDP growth rate plummeting to negative 13.974% in 1972, before rebounding to 9.592% in 1974. After that, Bangladesh has another recession from 1974 to 1976, during which the growth rate drops to negative 0.4088% in 1975 and peaks at 5.661% in 1976. Bangladesh experiences small recessions and expansions from year to year after these three big depressions and expansions. But when GDP growth rate peaks at 8.153% in 2019, there is a substantial decrease in percentage in 2019 to 2020, with the GDP growth rate receding to 2.376% at the end of the graph. Recently, in 2020, there are four major industries that make up most imports in Bangladesh. The first is the cotton industry, which accounts for 10.5% of overall imports and has a value of 4.9 billion. Some products that make up the cotton industry are cotton itself that is uncarded and uncombed, which makes up a total of 1.5 billion, and another being woven fabrics that are 85% cotton, which make up a total of 954.3 million. The second major industry is the machinery industry, which accounts for 10.3% of overall imports and has a value of 4.8 billion. Some goods that come from there that make up the total imports are temperature change machines that totals 312.6 million, and another being computers and optical readers that make up 229.9 million. The third industry is the fuel industry, which makes up 7.9% of overall imports and has a value of 3.6 billion. Some goods from the fuel industry are one, coal, that makes up a total of 392.1 million in the country, and another one being electrical energy that makes up a total of 424.7 million. The fourth major industry that makes up imports is the electronics industry, which is 7.1% of overall imports, which has a value of 3.3 billion. Some goods from there that make up most of the 3.3 billion are one, smartphones, which make up 1.1 billion, and electrical motors / generators, which make up 252.2 million in purchases. Furthermore, in 2020, there are three major industries that make up most exports in Bangladesh. So one major industry and the biggest exporting industry in Bangladesh is the apparel industry, which makes up 95.6% of overall exports and has a revenue of over 36.5 billion. The apparel industry also has three sub-industries that include one, the knitting and crocheting industry, that totals 18.7 billion and makes up 45.2% of total exports. The second is the clothing and accessories, which are not knitting or crocheting, that totals 16.6 billion and makes up 40.2% of overall exports. And the third being miscellaneous textiles, that totals 1.2 billion and makes up 2.8% of overall exports. Um, Other main industries that make up overall exports are one, the fishing industry, which makes up 1.1% of overall exports and generates 416 million in revenue, and the animal goods industry, which is 1.3% of overall exports and generates a total of 579 million in revenue. In conclusion, Bangladesh's total exported goods represent 4.3% of overall gross domestic product for 2020, and Bangladesh's imported an estimated total of 46.4 billion worth of goods and exported an estimated total of 41.3 billion, giving them a net export value of negative 5.1 billion.
So for part 4, number 4 was show the GDP composition as well as the labor composition of the major industries. And here we have the top industries that contribute to Bangladesh's GDP. And the top would be manufacturing at 5.2 million Bangladeshi taka. Next would be retail, and then services, followed right by agriculture at 2.6 million. Next is the top industries in Bangladesh based on employment, which industries employ the most people, where do most people work, that sort of thing. And here they are. Each of the top employers in Bangladesh are also on the top industries in Bangladesh for GDP. You can see at the top is services, which actually is a growing market. A lot more people are working there, followed by agriculture, which is actually shrinking. It's actually getting smaller over the years. And finally, manufacturing is also growing, but it's not quite as big. Alright, for number 6, I was asked to find some of the fiscal and monetary policies that Bangladesh has used to get out of a recession. So first what I did was I found when Bangladesh was in a recession in the past 15 years, and so what I found based on this graph was that their first recession in the last 15 years started in 2007 and went all the way to 2010. You can kind of see that big drop. And then after that, they had a little mini recession from 2013 to 14. And then, of course, the COVID pandemic at 2020 to 2021. So those were the 3 recessions in the past 15 years that Bangladesh had. Alright, and then, so as you can see, they really didn't do any notable monetary or fiscal policies in 2013 to get them out of that recession because it was so small. It was such a short recession. But in 2007, they basically did all of their work getting out of the recession by lowering interest rates, as you can see from they increased interest rates and then dropped it all the way back down to 0 to get people spending money again. So that was at, as you can see in the bottom graph, the interest rates was up at 8.5, almost 9 for a while, and then once 2010 came around, they dropped all the way down to almost nothing. And then in 2020, they also did the same thing. They dropped the interest rates, not by quite as much this time, but it did happen. Another strategy they took in 2021 was they increased the money supply, as you can see from the top graph. Right at March, is at almost 2 billion or 2 trillion, and they increased that to about 2.4 trillion. So they increased that by 400 billion Bangladeshi taka in 2021, and finally in 2020 they lowered the income tax rate by 5%. As you can see in the middle graph, it had been at about 30 for a while, and they dropped it down to 25 in 2020 just to get people spending more money, get them out of their economic recession.